Hey everybody. I've been listening to Daniel Schmachtenberger. Let's see if I can get this right. Schmachtenberger. And I was listening to his two podcasts, which I haven't finished the second one of, entitled The War on Sense-Making, presented by Rebel Wisdom. And I have a number of topics on my mind. We'll see how things turn out in terms of if I can organize them and integrate them somewhat coherently. But I'll have a go at it. So I have to take a little bit of risk. The risk of failing or falling down or making mistakes, getting it wrong, becoming confused, following too closely the framework I have in mind is a risk, and so is following it too loosely. Under ordinary circumstances, we are easily distracted by the peculiar, very striking capacity of our minds, something I'm going to pose as metaphysical in the sense that no one can physically grasp the mind or their mind. But the fact that we have this capacity for complex representational sophistication, and that's a word that I choose very carefully in order to contrast it with intelligence. I make that contrast because our complex representational sophistication is entirely distinct from one of its branches. And that branch is the one we would associate with deep, clear, broad awareness, with creativity, symbiosis, rather than abiosis, with non-zero-sum games, with the capacity for arriving at novel insight, leading to trustworthy, truthful new opportunities for everyone, even for the living planet. Because whether or not we were endowed by something divine with the peculiar capabilities our mental interiority present, these capabilities have invested us with otherwise unimaginable powers. Historically, for humans, over the last 10,000 years, and extremely so over the last 200 to 500 years, this endowment has resulted in Hamartia, which I might misunderstand the correct definition from the Greek, or is it Latin? Hamartia is a process whereby, through the continuing amplification of hubris, there's a response from the context itself of instantiating processes that are monstrous and demonic. And often the results of this are apocalyptic. And sometimes, once in a while, they give birth to heroes. Now, so as not to lose my train of thought, I'm going to backtrack a bit to the idea that we're in the peculiar predicament of being engaged with mind-like states and behaviors. And these, over their normal propagation and processes that resemble selection in ecologies, can quickly become so inflated that we cannot maintain the homeostatic balance, the coherence of anything resembling awareness or intelligence or creativity or insight. And in case that sounds paradoxical, paradoxes are usually produced by an erroneous frame collapse, meaning that we collapse a complex frame to a simple one. We collapse a multi-layered constellation of elements to a flat map. And this process of flattening, literally of explanation, produces paradoxes when we do it inelegantly. There are contrasts and conflicts that underpin the possibility, the broad forests, the jungles of possibility that are our actual inheritance as human beings. But these can easily be cruelly impoverished, momentarily, for individuals and groups, but even over the long spans of epochs and the developmental phases of our species and what we call our societies. So, just as all of you are to some degree, I am subject to the storms of consciousness, even while I'm trying to coherently organize my thoughts and goals so that I can speak meaningfully about them and articulately, if I'm lucky, or skillful, or both, or three things, one of which I don't know the name of. So I want to highlight what I'm going to call the red herring effect, which is the capacity in the mind of a person or conceivable group to become perilously distracted by the sudden inflation of some subject of attention or idea, position, campaign, so on. It's a very delicate process to inhabit the position of observer above the landscapes of mind-like behavior and processes, so that instead of being gravitically drawn into them, identifying with them, pursuing them with great enthusiasm or vigor, we give things time for the things that are rapidly inflating to either burst or have their energy drawn away by processes that are more trustworthy, not as belligerent, and thus less loud. We can notice, for example, that in human behavior, particularly in relational behavior between groups of people who actually know each other, the guy who plays the comedian doesn't run around telling everyone how funny he is. The girl who plays, even for a moment, these plays may be brief, the artist doesn't go around telling people why her art is the best. And if the girl's the comedian and the guy's the artist, fine. Or if, whoever is whatever, fine. But the comedian, the comic, walks into the room, takes a glance around, and within, a minute, everybody in the room is gripping their guts and trying not to pee their pants, and right? The comic enacts rather than declares. The dancer enacts. Telling someone you dance is completely dead next to dancing with someone, for someone. Enacted intelligence, it doesn't advertise real loud, almost never. It doesn't need to, because its inaction is better than a verbal seduction, right? Or a commercial seduction. And the same is true in our minds, and in our own minds. And the louder voices are often the least trustworthy. And they're an attempt to collapse the observer above all processes down into one of those processes. And the result is, not always, but frequently, Hamartia in our own minds, in our own bodies, right? We summon Nemesis, and then, there's this felt sense of great power during the summoning until the consequences come home, and home is obliterated. Coherence is obliterated. Liberty obliterated. Humanity obliterated. intelligence obliterated. Intelligence is a luxury. You have it when you have the space in which to grow it together. And whether that's together with the various aspects of your psyche and habits and mind, or whether it's together as in a small, tightly knit group, or a sports team, or an acting troupe, or an orchestra. Together brings symbiotic superfunction. The birthplace of heroic acts of beauty, humanity, grace, humility, reverence, wonder, awe, ecstasis, freedom from Hamartia. Whenever you see layers collapsing, if you can learn to see the layers of things, right, and notice when they start to collapse, whether we're talking about layers like the entire body, the nervous system, the organs, the brain, the psyche, the subconscious, the unconscious, or actually I got those two backwards, the mind, and then the sort of crust, right, the habits on top of the mind. This is one way of viewing layers. When you see those starting to collapse, it's a powerful hint that we should pay attention to the result. And we should be aware that collapses that produce paradox or bipolar opposites, while sometimes useful, are extremely inelegant and often harmful. So I want to highlight this problem with our minds producing a big bubble that we then collapse into identification with an idea or a mandate, a declaration, an agenda, a campaign. And it isn't to say by a long shot that no campaign is a good campaign, though some might equate that with being more sensitive to the actual complexity in relationships than if we were to collapse it down to a thing and then collapse ourselves into that thing. I want to just highlight that as a red herring, as something that pulls us aside from our actual liberty, potential for deep and meaningful learning and awareness and growth, for creativity and play. And because humans are social animals, as people around us begin to collapse into positions, we become more inclined to go with that flow. And if the positions are bipolar, maybe in the sense more analogous to the pathology than the mathematical analogy, we might get really stuck. Here's why. We're likely to fall victim to a false dichotomy, and thus be forced to choose between two really bad choices. I'll give you an example. suppose the idea of voting could be reasonably, a flaw with it could be pointed out by making an analogy. And the analogy is, you can either have a new heart or new lungs. Now, if that were actually possible, it would be wildly bizarre metabolically. But the idea that you either get to have a heart or you get to have lungs, no one would sign up for that. Because hearts don't work without lungs. And if the heart works better, the lungs work better. And if the lungs work better, the heart works better. And it's not, you see, it's not a competitive dichotomy. It's a synergistic dichotomy. But what we're faced with is something even weirder. You can either have a new fake heart, or you can get new fake lungs that inherit all kinds of problems and diseases and bizarre artifacts and conflicts to the degree that they actually aren't they're neither hearts nor lungs. And that's more like the situation we're in the United States circa 2020. We have to vote for one of two really dangerously deceptive, manipulative monsters, and then collapse into identification with one of the other of these choices. And if we don't make a choice, well, we can be seen as part of the problem. Which problem, though? I noticed something really peculiar, and it was rewarding briefly to notice it when I was listening to the Rebel Wisdom podcast with Daniel Schmachtenberger. The producers did something that in this case represents both a very bold experiment and the possibility of a profound optimization or transformation of common practice. And if you're not aware of this immediately, it might not be apparent, though you'll wonder why there's music every once in a while. What they do is they occlude the question that they're asking Daniel with music. Probably 96% of the time. Every once in a while you hear a question. And by doing so, they could be understood to be introducing intelligent ambiguity, and also they're retreating from the limelight, right? The podcasters don't become stars, they become sources of gravity that draw amazing articulations, in Daniel's case, but take no credit for having done so. It's a very peculiar altruistic strategy. I was really surprised when I figured out that's what was going on. And perhaps, I'm clumsy and I should have noticed it immediately. I did notice the music. It just didn't click in my mind that those pauses of music between Daniel's topics represented their questions. But this reminds me too of the observer above, the landscape of mental processes, right? They don't have to have a face. They don't need a name. Or it doesn't need a name. And it's not precisely impartial, but it's very cautious about collapsing into what it's observing. because that preserves crucial assets that are otherwise offloaded into costs and damage and danger and illness and injury and war and conflict, which are in fact generally unnecessary. I've heard occasionally people say, well, you have amazing ideas, Darren, but can you show me an actual example of them? It's not too difficult. Your body. To the degree elements of your body, whether these are single cells or neurons or organs, bones, mental constructs, no, I'm going to leave those out. Let's go to the body. To the degree that they can be understood to be distinct, we find primarily that's the result of the imposition of a framework that wants to make parts out of wholes. But your body wasn't assembled from parts. In fact, it wasn't assembled at all. You might say it was expressed by the entire history and perhaps even the future of life on Earth. All of the beings. But they don't compete against each other for resources. And if they did anything even vaguely resembling what the organs of the simulated anatomy of one of our cultures did, if they competed and engaged in zero-sum games, you probably wouldn't live more than a few seconds. So why isn't everything dead? Before I answer that question, the elements of the body, and I mean, there are trillions of cells, countless viruses. It isn't as though there's nothing like conflict, because we experience illness, and our immune systems can be understood, it's not the only way to think of them, as brains or armies. But it's very sophisticated. The immune system is unimaginably sophisticated. Our grasp on it is extremely primitive so far, for all we have learned. And the health and well-being of all of the elements depends upon the health and well-being of all of the elements. So, with the exceptions of the intrusion of injury, of illness or injury, in which case things shift a bit, we have a functionally auto-altruistic, right? It's naturally altruistic. My health increases your health. Union, so unity first. And the idea of there even being separate parts is sort of an intellectual add-on that is not entirely unrelated to us reifying organisms in the image of the machines we make. Though there were different understandings of elements or parts prior to the onset of machines in ancient cultures. There's plenty of evidence for that. This garden is not tearing itself apart. It's not sacrificing its past or future to kill all the other things so that one plant can propagate wildly. Though there are plants that propagate wildly. War might be the wrong metaphor for that. I might prefer to view it as a kind of innate opportunism. that got expressed evolutionarily. But it's not my intent to talk in depth about this subject. I merely wanted to say that if your body had to pick a party, you'd be dead. And there's all kinds of sophisticated symbiotic interplay that produces unimaginable superfunction every second of your life. You don't have one eye, you have two. And I'm cribbing a little bit from Daniel here. One eye doesn't give you peripheral vision, it doesn't give you depth. Two eyes, having both of them, really good thing. But they're not in conflict. Your eyes aren't fighting each other. In fact, they're they're an aspect of a very sophisticated network that's capable of all kinds of astonishing things that don't even make any sense, really, in terms of trying to break them down into constituent elements. So one of my examples is just your body or your hand. The fact that I have different, digits, they're each one unique. And I have two of these amazing things. They don't get in fights with each other. It's never happened. Not even one time did my pinky say, well, that index finger is so dang long that, my sovereignty, right? Well, what's the sovereignty of a pinky? Its identity belongs first to unity. It excels first in union with other beings. And this is the nature of nature, fundamentally. Now, because we are representational animals, we can do this other crazy-ass thing. This wide array of other crazy-ass things that depart from unity in a way that is not dissimilar to how cancer cells depart from the symbiotic union of the body. And it should be clear that when these metastasize, the extreme individuality, the refusal to pass away, the refusal to belong, the urge for eternal life as an individual takes over. And we get Hamartia, Nemesis, apocalypse. It's very ironic and paradoxical that the urge for immortality kills you. This is from Eric Weinstein. And success at immortality turns you into a giant tumor. Or rather, you have immortality because you die, right? For the first one. Yeah, that's I think what he said. Something I'm paraphrasing slightly. The human minds comprise a hypersystem that's hyper-connected, and it's connected in ways we don't even have words for, though it's also connected by technologies, including the technology of speaking words, writing things, making videos, and so on. But I want you to understand that the things, I want you to entertain the idea, actually, that the things that we see as the connectors in the networks are less than half of the connectors in the networks, and that many of those connectors are inconceivable to us. That humanity maybe like the world that spawned it, is a superorganism first. Societies only abstractly, and individuals when it breaks down. See, in your body, if your cells had to act as individuals, they'd be dead right away. In the sense of truly individuated from the body, right? Separated from the body. Receiving only the merits of their own work and contributing nothing to the merits of others, right? That's a dead cell. But maybe that analogy isn't all that great. Though it's important to understand that it's the unity of conceivably discrete members that produces superfunction. And I'm suggesting that humanity is first a superorganism, and I will suggest that the Earth, the living ecologies of Earth, represent something above organism, not below it, that we don't even have a reasonable word for. And that the ecologies of Earth, including mankind, humanity, God, I can't get away from it, including Homo sapiens, I know there's no way around it. There are ways around it. But our species is an organ in ecology. It's not outside it, except abstractly. And some of our behaviors act from outside. So that there are invisible transports in the networks that unify all human minds. And I would further suggest, because I'm radical, that they extend both into the past of humanity and into the future. Some of these transports. For sure, some of them do. In fact, what we call evolution is one way of understanding a relatively materialistic, one way of very partially understanding a relatively materialistic aspect of the transports from the, connect us to the past and the future. But I suspect it's even weirder than that. I suspect somehow it's possible to change the past from here. In any case, there are storms in the cogniscium, in the network of human minds, but they are first unities. First they are one. From this perspective I suggest. And just like a single mind, right? What is the observer position above the human cogniscium, the cogniscium of our species? Can individuals access that? I believe yes. Can they meaningfully access it? Yes. I think so. Not probably before. Can they consciously access it? That's a trickier question. The answer to that one is not probably before they become aware of the possibility of it. However, that's also a partially true answer because there are aspects of our ordinary cognition, including my capacity to put sentences together moment to moment right now, that I suspect derive from my participation in the cogniscium of our species, in the unity mind of our people, all the people. But because I think we are representational animals, because we have this extra layer of both potential and danger, our people are constantly misdirected, confused, paradoxically self-threatened, other-threatened. All of these little abstract barriers arise between us, first in thought, then in action, or thought, speech, action. And of course, we're capable of flipping that polarity, right? So that our thoughts, speech, and behavior encourage and recognize the fundamental interdependence, not merely of all of the participants in our species, but of all of life on Earth. Extended all the way back as far as you care into history, and all the way forward into the future. Nature is far too complex to characterize easily, though. I will occasionally take that risk. But symbiosis trumps competition. Not necessarily an evolutionary theory, and I'm not dismissing that theory. In the moment-to-moment survival of my actual body and my capacity to form coherent mind states and reach for awareness and insight and wonder, learning, intelligence, and play. Now, I'm going to close with a perspective on intervals, which is a continuation from my last video's topic. As I mentioned a moment ago, I think it's useful to consider our world as meta to the class of thing, for sure, and meta to the class of organism. And we don't really have good language for any of this, or if there is, I'm not yet aware of it. So it's a super being, and it has senses that are embodied as you and me and every living thing on the planet. And those senses are also its organs. And when they're damaged, it suffers, and when they thrive, it thrives. And it has something better than a mind. And it's not concerned with words. Except if one of its children starts making them in a way that causes everything to collapse, then it might maybe become concerned. But my point is that for a living world, the interval of a day is infinitesimally small. If Earth had a heartbeat, an actual heartbeat, right? It would probably be like, well, we might imagine it to be something like 1 pulse per 1,000 years, or something like this, or 10,000 years. And the reason that I'm saying this is that I believe the Earth has something analogous to senses and experience, and feels something meta to well-being, awareness, consciousness. But the intervals of her temporality are extremely long by our standards. And this is part of why most change is gradual, right? And happens over very long periods of time. Evolution is a process that happens a little faster in organisms, and very fast in some organisms, and blazingly fast in very tiny organisms. Partly because there are so many more vehicles in the microbes than there are at the animal scale. But those evolutions are linked. So, for the Earth, a meaningful interval, a very, very small meaningful interval, might be 1,000 years. And change, most of the time, in the homeostatic basis of life on Earth, is also gradual. That can be radically affected by events we would refer to as catastrophic, such as the sudden emission of vast amounts of methane into the atmosphere, strikes by extraterrestrial bodies such as asteroids or large rocks or ice, changes in the relationship with the sun, many of which we don't even, again, have language about. Changes possibly in the local context of time-space, which we know nothing about, essentially. Nearly nothing. And finally, the possibility that one organism will go haywire and start wiping out everything that moves and most of what doesn't. Now, in Earth's timescales, the catastrophic obliteration of the ecologies that is the result primarily of human commercial and war activity over the past 100 years is absolutely unprecedented. Although we can go really far back and find a precedent, which I'll return to in a little bit. Our species has become self and other obliterating. Right? Like a child who sells his own organs to black marketeers to buy an iPad or some heroin, and then just keeps doing that until there's no more person. No more life. We've been offloading the damage of our industrial and commercial and war activity onto the ecologies. If we did something like that in our own bodies to an equivalent extent, again, we would not live 1 minute. And as Daniel argues, there's something similar going on in the domain of human representational intelligence, right? We're engineering diseases that masquerade as useful information. We're infecting each other with them, forming little protector networks for them, engaging in narrative warfare, essentially obliterating the possibility of coherence of our, thought and aspect that relates with ideology. We're obliterating our capacity for sensing truthfulness and for behaving truthfully. And most of that is in the name of convenience. And by the way, all that representational stuff, that game, what we do is we offload the necessity of paying clear attention, focused, aware attention, inhabiting the position above the landscape of mental activity. We're offloading that so that we can stop doing it into a little framework or idea or concept or fear or motivation. And then we collapse into that. The result, right? We collapse into the result. For convenience. In order to skip relating. In order to skip time. In order to throw away dimensions of relational opportunity and intelligence by the bushel, right? Just burn those up to produce a little artifact, not unlike a religious symbol, that we can sort of trust in, right? So we can excuse ourselves, mostly unconsciously, most of this isn't conscious, from being present, from embodied awareness, from participatory insight and relation. And while that works as a strategy in a lot of domains, it leads to machines, war, terrible disease, though it occasionally also positively affects those diseases with immunological discoveries and so on. It causes a whole shit fire of nightmares. But it's very convenient. There's nothing more convenient than offloading your capacity. Now, if we take convenience to mean just getting rid of, right? It's totally inconvenient if we look at the results and discover, oh shit, that gets everything killed, including me. Right? That's not convenient. So maybe we should say it presents the visage of convenience and occasionally embodies it usefully, right? But a vast portion of that activity is hiding Hamartia, the production of Nemesis, and Apocalypse. And we're trading that not for true convenience, truthful convenience, but for temporal and behavioral convenience. I don't have to do the thing. The machine does the thing, I take care of the machine, right? The idea does the thing, I propagate the idea. The, political party does the thing, I endorse the political party. I don't cook food, I don't compose food, I eat it. I don't create music, I purchase it. I don't write stories, I read them. I don't live stories, I'm interested in consuming them. Now, none of these are absolutes. All of this stuff's fairly fuzzy, and there are exceptions. And I'm not meaning in any way to be an absolutist, which, carefully examined, sounds almost like absolutism, doesn't it? Except that I'm leaving a big open door, right, for the exceptions, and recognizing them. So the red herrings and the weaponized information, even in our own minds, that causes us to collapse from the observer who isn't impartial, but is fully endowed with the assets and opportunities that are natural to our humanity. That's what I mean by this observer. Because they have not yet collapsed, right, into identification with some project or idea or task or distraction or convenience. We can move together from the landscape of mental processes to the landscape, not the landscape, to the atmosphere of mutually concerned beings capable of embodying the assets and faculties and potentials that are the most precious endowments of our species and our roles in the history of life on Earth, of our species, and of the future of life on Earth. And if we can merely move in that direction, right, if we can set our compass thusward, our lives and our experience of life, our minds and our experience of mental behavior and processes transforms almost immediately. It can take time. It doesn't transform completely overnight, though there are exceptions, again. So, it seems to me hope lies in that direction. We have examples all around us of that. And we can form examples moment to moment with each other, even if their interval is very small, in which we do precisely that. And we love it. It's really fun. It's a lot better than any other game that's on the table, most of which involve having to collapse down to a pointy little weapon pointed at the opposite, the enemy, or a really round shield that's very thick pointed at everything. The Earth's intervals are small. The span over which humans have been ripping the ecologies to shreds and making billions of machines, it's less than 200 years. The Earth had the intuition something was wrong in this parable that I'm spinning about 50 years ago. And that's when it started to leak into human consciousness that, hey, these ecologies, maybe it's not a good idea to rip them to shreds and build giant warships and atomic bombs and billions of cars and things. Right? So the human cogniscium is not distinct from the hypercogniscium of life on Earth, right? We're just pretty dense. You don't tend to get the message when it comes through. And also we tend to be listening in language, and the world speaks in languages that far predate words. Perhaps in us the world speaks most accessibly in feelings and senses. So it's been a very short process. But the Earth is certainly concerned, aware, meta-aware, meta-concerned. Again, we don't have language for the processes in beings above the order of beings, but Earth is one of those. And I must presume, I'm going to gender the Earth female as it's common in my traditional language to do so. I'm going to presume that she not merely has feelings and intuitions and senses, she has friends. She has friends that adore her and are of kinds, again, we don't even have language for. And one of those friends is the sun. So, if something starts killing off the Earth, wiping out her organs, her friends, if necessary, if that being or process isn't delineating, right, doesn't cause itself to stop, then, in other words, if it doesn't by itself produce Nemesis and auto-apocalypse, then other forces intervene, right? Just the same way, well, no, in a way meta-analogous to, we humans have doctors and surgeons, and we have other healers too. And some of them seem metaphysically powerful, and some of those are frauds, but not all of them are. Magic, the ongoing development and experience of unexpected, staggering superfunction, comes from unity. But if we should actually choose to demonstrate directly with our physical and emotional and psychological and mental behavior that we are outside nature, in that case, all fans become made of shit. Shit doesn't hit the fan, now you just got shit fans. It is as if there are 100 invisible umbilicuses that connect each one of us and our species to the living world. We've been hacking away at those things. We don't need that. We're above all this for hundreds of years. Less than an eye blink in terrestrial history. I'm sure you see the implications of what I presented, so I won't present them concretely. I'll just say that in Earth time, we've been misbehaving for a long time, but our species has been catastrophically misbehaving for a good couple of hundred years, which probably isn't even equivalent to a second of the world's experience. But the world knows something's wrong. And the animals and plants are changing. They're adapting to the new situation, almost as if they can predict it. Or so it sometimes seems to me. The beauty of life on Earth is most coherently expressed in us as humility, not hubris. The grace, the epic adventure of the living beings on this world over time, floating through space. Are our origin. And we, I say, have not merely a responsibility or an obligation, we have the privilege of walking in beauty and humility, awe and reverence, wonder and altruistic ecstasis on the face of a mystery so profound that language and concepts will never encompass it. And perhaps if we could bear this in our hearts and minds a little more often, a little more continuously each day, perhaps we could cure the catastrophic injury and illness presently dominating the human cogniscium and the history and future of life on our world. But even if we were to fail at that goal, I trust this setting on the compass. I don't merely have faith in it. I have observed its efficacy, its beauty, its truthfulness. I have experienced them viscerally and materially. I'm here to learn and discover. I'm here to grow and wonder.